Chapter 1: The Wine Chamber. The chamber has no windows. This is deliberate, of course. It is everything about this room was designed with intention. The stone walls thick enough to swallow sound. The single iron door bolted from the outside. The air already heavy with sweetness. A cloying floral scent that masks something darker underneath. In the center of the room, a vessel, large, bronze, ornate enough to belong in a palace courtyard, where guests might toast victories or celebrate harvests. But this vessel was not brought here for celebration. It stands nearly chest-high, filled to the brim with wine, deep red, almost black. In the flickering torchlight, the liquid surface perfectly still, like glass, like a mirror reflecting nothing but shadow. 2 guards flank the door. Their faces are stone. They have been chosen for this, not for their strength, but for their silence, for their ability to stand witness without becoming memory. The prince enters. He does not enter willingly. His wrists are bound not with rope, but with silk. A mockery of dignity, purple silk. The color of royalty. His robes are immaculate. No signs of torture, no evidence of mistreatment. He could be arriving at a banquet. But his eyes tell a different story. They dart from the vessel to the guards, to the door behind him, calculating, measuring, searching for an exit that does not exist. He knows what this room is. He knows what that vessel means. Even if no one has spoken the words aloud, even if the order came wrapped in formal language and religious justification, he knows. One of the guards steps forward, not roughly, almost gently, as if guiding him toward a bath. As if this were merely ceremony, the prince resists. His feet drag against stone. His breath comes fast, a panic rising like floodwater behind a cracking dam. He tries to speak, but his voice emerges as something broken, something pleading. Please. The word hangs in the perfumed air unanswered. They move him toward the vessel, each step an eternity. The wine surface remains undisturbed, patient, waiting. This is when the true horror begins, not with violence, but with the terrible slowness of it. The way they position him at the vessel's edge, the way they do not shout or strike, but simply apply steady, inexorable pressure, the way the prince's breathing shifts from panic to something beyond panic, to a high keening sound that no prince should ever make. His head is pushed toward the wine, not quickly, not with anger, but with the methodical care of men following instructions. With the mechanical precision of ritual, the surface breaks. Wine splashes over the rim. Dark droplets scatter across pale stone like prophecy. The prince's body convulses, fighting every animal instinct, screaming for air, for life, for mercy that will not come. The guards hold firm. This is how empires maintain themselves, not through glory on battlefields, not through wisdom in council chambers, but through moments like this, through fathers who can order such things, through guards who can execute them, through wine that can drown a prince as effectively as any ocean. The struggling intensifies, then weakens. Bubbles rise to the surface, each one a stolen breath, each one carrying away whatever remained of innocence, or hope, or the belief that royal blood offers any protection from the appetites of power outside the chamber. Footsteps echo down marble corridors. Servants move through their routine. Scribes record the day as administrative details. Musicians practice in distant halls. Life continues its performance, utterly indifferent to what unfolds behind this sealed door. Inside, time stretches and compresses simultaneously. How long does it take for a man to drown in wine? Long enough to understand the symbolism, to recognize that this death was chosen specifically for him. A death without marks, a death that can be whispered about in metaphors, a death that transforms celebration into execution. Long enough to know who ordered it. The vessel's contents grow still again. Eventually, inevitably, the guards step back, their duty fulfilled, their silence purchased with gold or fear. Both. The prince remains where he fell, slumped against bronze, his fine robes soaked dark, his face turned away from the torchlight. One guard moves to the door, knocks twice. A signal from beyond comes, a voice muffled but clear. It is done. 3 words that will echo through generations. 3 words that seal not just a death, but a dynasty's damnation. 3 words spoken with neither triumph nor regret, but with the flat finality of fate fulfilled. The door opens briefly, light spills and then vanishes as it closes again. The chamber returns to shadow, to silence, to the heavy sweetness of spilled wine. and something far more precious built with it outside in halls adorned with conquest and glory. A father receives confirmation that his son will never threaten his throne again. Inside, a prince lies still, surrounded by what was meant to bring joy, transformed into an instrument of family annihilation. This is how the story ends, but to understand how a father arrives at such a moment, how an empire constructs the machinery to drown its own future in luxury, we must step back 3 years through bloodlines, through the accumulated weight of power that teaches men to fear their own children more than any foreign enemy. We must return to the beginning, to understand the blood that flows through royal veins and what it demands in payment. Chapter 2. Blood of kings. Empires are not born. They are forged in fire, watered with blood, and built upon foundations of calculated cruelty. This particular dynasty emerged from chaos 3 centuries before our prince drew his final wine-soaked breath, a warlord with vision and brutality in equal measure. Carved territory from a fractured continent, he united tribes through a combination of strategic marriage, military genius, and a willingness to erase entire bloodlines that opposed him. His successors learned the lesson: world power does not flow naturally from parent to child. It must be seized, defended, maintained through constant vigilance. The throne room might glitter with gold and marble, but its true foundation is suspicion. By the time our prince was born, the dynasty had perfected a particular form of succession, one that outsiders found barbaric, but which the ruling family considered necessary. Every generation faced the same challenge: too many sons, each one a potential claimant, each one surrounded by advisors and generals who saw opportunity in royal blood. The solution was elegant in its horror. Sons did not wait for their father's natural death to claim inheritance. They competed. They proved themselves through military campaigns, through administrative skill, through the careful accumulation of loyal forces. And when the emperor weakened, when age or illness made him vulnerable, the strongest son moved. Fratricide was not merely accepted. It was expected, encouraged. Even a son who lacked the will to eliminate his brothers was considered too weak to hold an empire together. The official histories called this the trial of succession. Religious scholars wrote elaborate justifications claiming divine approval for the victor. Poets transformed brutal murders into heroic narratives of strength overcoming weakness. But beneath the poetry lay simple mathematics. An empire could not be divided among multiple heirs without fragmenting into civil war. Better to spill royal blood in controlled doses than to drown the realm in it. Our prince was born into this legacy. His father had claimed the throne through orthodox means he eliminated 4 brothers over the course of 7 years. Each death meticulously documented as justified by treasonous behavior. Whether the treason was real or manufactured hardly mattered. The bodies were real, the throne was real, everything else was merely story. The new emperor ruled with the paranoia of someone who understood exactly how thrones were won. He saw threats everywhere, in the way generals grew too popular, in the way merchants accumulated too much wealth, in the way religious leaders commanded loyalty that rivaled his own, and most dangerously in the way his own sons began to mature into men with ambitions of their own. This was the atmosphere our prince breathed from his first moment. His nursery was staffed with spies, his toys were examined for hidden weapons, his playmates were chosen based on family loyalty, not friendship. When he learned to walk, guards shadowed his steps. When he learned to speak, tutors monitored his words. Childhood in the palace was preparation for one of 2 futures. Either you would kill your family and claim power, or you would be killed by them and become a footnote. There was no third option. The dynasty's blood carried this certainty through generations, like an inherited disease, a curse that transformed sons into threats and fathers into executioners. The prince's mother understood this. She had watched 3 of her husband's brothers vanish from court, their names scratched from official records, their portraits painted over, their children reassigned to distant provinces or simply disappeared. She tried to protect her son not through rebellion that was suicide, but through careful orchestration of insignificance. She counseled him to avoid excellence in military matters, lest he appear too capable. She advised him to show deference in court lest he seemed too ambitious. She taught him the art of being overlooked for years. It worked. The prince became a ghost in his own palace, present, but unremarkable, educated, but not brilliant, obedient, but not memorable. He attended ceremonies without drawing attention. He studied texts without challenging interpretations. He existed in a carefully maintained state of harmless mediocrity, but mediocrity can only protect for so long. As the emperor aged, as his health began its inevitable decline, the calculations shifted. An insignificant son was safe only when there were more prominent targets. Once his brothers began their own deadly dance of succession. Once the empire itself started showing cracks, insignificance became its own form of threat. A weak son could not hold the empire together. And weakness in this dynasty, in this blood-soaked lineage of calculated murders and justified betrayals, weakness was the greatest treason of all. The prince found himself trapped between equally fatal positions: be strong and become a threat worthy of elimination, be weak and become a liability worthy of removal. His father began to watch him differently. Not with affection. Distance had killed whatever paternal instinct might have existed years ago, but with assessment, with the cold calculation of an emperor evaluating assets and liabilities, running scenarios in which each son represented both solution and problem. In the palace, as shadowed corridors, advisors whispered. Their words carried more weight than any formal decree. They spoke of instability, of succession crises, of the need for clarity about the future. They spoke about which sons might need to be removed before they became problems. And somewhere in those whispers, in those calculated assessments, in the steady accumulation of paranoia disguised as prudence, a father began constructing the logic that would allow him to drown his own child in wine. The machinery of justified murder was ancient, well-oiled, waiting only for someone to pull the lever. Chapter 3: Race to Fear. Morning lessons began before dawn. This was tradition, not cruelty. Exactly, though the line between them had long since blurred. In the palace, the young prince would be woken by silent servants dressed in clothing designed not to show bloodstains. Though no one spoke this detail aloud, everyone understood its significance. His first tutor was an old man whose face bore scars from wars fought before the prince was born. He taught rhetoric, philosophy, the classical texts, but beneath every lesson ran a darker curriculum: how to speak without revealing intention, how to agree without committing, how to exist in a room full of enemies while appearing to see only friends. One morning, the tutor placed 2 scrolls before the prince. Both contained poetry. One genuinely praised the emperor as wisdom. The other concealed subtle criticism wrapped in metaphor and carefully chosen words. Read these, the tutor instructed. Tell me which one will get its author executed. The prince was 7 years old. He studied both scrolls. His small fingers traced characters. He barely understood, his face furrowed with concentration. Finally, he pointed to the one that seemed more beautiful, more eloquent. Wrong. The tutor's hand struck the table, not the child. But the sound made the prince flinch. The obvious criticism is safe. Everyone sees it. Everyone knows how to respond. But the subtle poison, the one that sounds like praise while planting doubt, that is what kills empires, and emperors kill. What threatens empires? The lesson was clear. Intelligence was not enough. Sincerity was dangerous. Excellence itself could be fatal. What mattered was reading the invisible currents, understanding what people meant beneath what they said. By age 10, the prince could navigate court politics with the skill of men 3 times his age. He knew which advisors held real power versus ceremonial titles. He understood which generals commanded loyalty versus fear. He recognized the difference between a smile of alliance and a smile of anticipated betrayal. But knowledge brought no comfort, only sharper awareness of his own vulnerability. His brothers were his most immediate threat. There were 5 in total, though the number fluctuated. Birth order mattered less than capability, and backing. Each had their faction, each cultivated different strengths. The eldest mastered military strategy, the second one charmed religious authorities, the third accumulated wealth through trade networks. The prince chose none of these paths. Following his mother's guidance, he became the scholar, the one who preferred libraries to training grounds, who showed enthusiasm for administrative details that bored his brothers, who could recite legal precedents but fumbled sword drills. It was camouflage protective coloring in an environment where standing out meant standing in crosshairs. For years it worked. His brothers dismissed him as irrelevant, their factions ignored him as harmless. Even his father seemed to forget his existence for months at a time, attending ceremonies without acknowledging him, speaking of succession plans as if he had only 4 sons instead of 5. The prince told himself this was safety. But safety in the palace was always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on circumstances beyond any individual's control. The shift began subtly. The emperor's health declined, nothing dramatic at first, just increased fatigue, more frequent absences from public ceremonies, a persistent cough that court physicians attributed to seasonal changes, but which everyone recognized as something worse. Suddenly succession stopped being theoretical future concern and became immediate practical crisis. The brothers' factions mobilized, their careful maneuvering became open positioning, military commanders were courted, administrative posts were contested, religious endorsements were sought. Every dinner, every ceremony, every hunting trip became opportunity for alliance building and rival undermining, and the prince found his protective insignificance crumbling, because in a succession crisis, even the harmless brother becomes a piece on the board, a potential ally, a possible threat, a variable that needs accounting for. Envoys began appearing at his chambers, representatives from his brother's factions offering alliance, suggesting that support now would be remembered later, implying that neutrality was no longer an option. The prince tried to maintain his position. I am a scholar, not a claimant. I have no interest in power. But such declarations only made him more interesting. A brother who claimed no ambition could be the perfect puppet, a figurehead who could unite factions without threatening their real power holders, or alternatively a liar whose humility was itself a sophisticated strategy worthy of monitoring. The emperor noticed this attention. During one rare private audience, father and son faced each other across an ornate table covered in maps and reports. The emperor studied the prince with eyes that had ordered 1,000 deaths without hesitation. Your brothers seek your support, yes, father. And what do you tell them? That I am loyal only to you, that I have no desire for the throne, that I wish only to serve the empire in whatever capacity you deem appropriate. The emperor smiled. It was not a warm expression. You lie skillfully. I appreciate that, but understand this: when I die, and I will die soon, whatever you desire will become irrelevant. You will be used by someone, or you will be eliminated by someone. There is no third path. The prince felt ice settle in his stomach. No third path. The same conclusion his mother had taught him. The same reality that governed every breath he took, but hearing it from his father, spoken with such casual certainty, transformed abstract danger into imminent threat. What should I do? The emperor's smile faded. Survive for as long as you can, by whatever means necessary. And if you cannot survive, then die in a manner that does not weaken the empire. The audience ended. The prince returned to his chambers. His hands shook, not with fear exactly, but with the accumulated weight of understanding. He was not safe. He had never been safe, and the father whose blood he carried, the man who should by all natural law protect him, had just confirmed that the prince's life mattered less than political stability. That night the prince barely slept. Outside his door, guards stood watch, whether they were there to protect him or to prevent his escape. He could not say. In the palace, the distinction had long since ceased to matter. Somewhere in distant chambers, his brothers plotted. Somewhere in shadowed halls, advisors whispered. Somewhere in the imperial residence, his father coughed blood into silk handkerchiefs and calculated which sons needed to die before he did. The machinery of succession was accelerating, and the prince, raised to fear, trained in survival, educated in the art of being overlooked, was about to discover that sometimes the only thing more dangerous than being noticed is being related to someone who sees you as a problem requiring permanent solution. Chapter 4 Seeds of Paranoia. The letter arrived on rice paper sealed with wax that bore no identifying mark. It should never have reached the Emperor's hands. Personal correspondence was screened by multiple layers of officials, each one tasked with filtering threats, assessing risks, determining what deserved imperial attention. But this letter bypassed every safeguard. It appeared on the Emperor's desk one morning, placed with such precision that it seemed to have materialized rather than been delivered. No servant admitted to carrying it, no guard recalled seeing anyone approach. Yet there it sat waiting. The Emperor opened it. Inside, a single page written in elegant calligraphy, the kind taught to nobility, the kind that suggested education and access. The message was brief: your son meets with the Southern generals. The scholar prince is not what he appears. Investigate the third moon of last autumn. You will find what he has hidden. No signature, no specific accusations, just enough detail to plant doubt, just enough vagueness to seem credible. The Emperor read it 3 times. Then he summoned his spymaster. The man who arrived moved through shadows as if born to them. His name was recorded in official documents, but never spoken aloud. He had served 3 emperors, always surviving transitions that killed lesser officials. His longevity was based on one particular skill. He knew how to tell powerful men what they needed to hear. The Emperor handed him the letter. What is this? The spymaster read slowly. His expression revealed nothing. It could be several things: a legitimate warning, a manufactured accusation, an attempt to destabilize before succession, or truth wrapped in conspiracy. Find out which one. The spymaster bowed. Of course, your majesty. And if it is true, if the prince has been meeting with military commanders without your knowledge, then we will address it accordingly. The spymaster withdrew. He did not need further instruction. He had orchestrated enough political eliminations to understand the subtext. When an emperor asks you to investigate his son, he is not seeking exoneration, he is seeking justification. The investigation began quietly. Servants were questioned, guards were interviewed, merchants who supplied the prince's household were examined about unusual purchases or unexplained expenses. Every detail of the prince's life was turned over like rocks, searching for serpents underneath. At first, nothing emerged. The prince's daily routine was exactly as reported: study, meals, ceremonies, correspondence. None of it suggested conspiracy. His few friends were fellow scholars. His expenditures were modest. His letters discussed poetry and administrative theory, not military strategy or political alliance. But the spymaster understood something crucial about investigations. If you look long enough with sufficient determination, you will find something, because perfection does not exist. Even innocence leaves traces that can be reinterpreted in sinister light. He found the meetings not secret gatherings in abandoned temples, not midnight conspiracies in locked rooms, but legitimate, unremarkable encounters that could be transformed through selective context. 6 months earlier, the prince had attended a military review. His father had been ill that week, unable to perform ceremonial duties. The prince was sent as imperial representative to observe training exercises and convey the emperor's regard to the troops. He had spoken with generals, toured facilities, shared a formal meal with senior commanders. All of this was documented, approved routine. The spymaster's report emphasized different details. The prince spent 4 hours with military leadership. He discussed logistics and supply chains. He asked questions about troop readiness and defensive capabilities. He appeared comfortable among soldiers. Despite his scholarly reputation, he demonstrated unexpected knowledge of military matters, every fact accurate, every implication poisonous. The report landed on the emperor's desk alongside others' financial records, showing the prince had purchased fine gifts delivered to various officials, including 2 generals who commanded border legions. The gifts were books, rare texts on history and philosophy, entirely appropriate for a scholarly prince maintaining relationships with educated military officers. The report described them as payments for loyalty, for future support, for building a faction. Another document detailed the prince's correspondence he had written to provincial governors discussing administrative challenges, offering suggestions based on classical precedents. The report characterized these letters as political organizing, building networks beyond the capital, establishing relationships that could be activated during succession crisis. None of it was definitive, all of it was damning. The spy must have presented his findings in private audience. Your Majesty, I cannot prove active conspiracy, but the pattern is concerning. A scholarly prince who avoids appearing ambitious, yet maintains contact with military power. A son who claims disinterest in politics, yet builds relationships with provincial authority. He paused, letting implications settle. It could be innocent, or it could be the most sophisticated preparation for succession challenge we have ever witnessed. Precisely because it appears innocent, the emperor sat in silence. This was the poison of paranoia. Once introduced, it spread through every thought, every memory recontextualized, every interaction re-examined. He recalled the prince's childhood obedience. Had that been genuine or calculated strategy? He remembered the prince's apparent lack of ambition. Had that been true nature or perfect camouflage? The more he questioned, the less certain anything became, until the only certainty was uncertainty itself, and uncertainty in matters of succession was intolerable. The emperor's advisors sensed the shift. They began offering counsel, carefully phrased, plausibly denied, but unmistakable in intent. Your Majesty faces a delicate situation, a son who may be innocent, but innocence is not the question. The question is stability when you die, and forgive the directness, but when you die, the empire will face crisis, multiple claimants, possible civil war. The southern generals hold significant power. If they believe they have a candidate they prefer, he did not finish the thought. He did not need to. Another advisor contributed. His perspective. History shows us that succession doubt kills more empires than external enemies. Your father understood this. He acted decisively. He ensured clarity, even when it required difficult decisions. Difficult decisions, a euphemism polished by generations of use. The emperor felt the weight of precedent. His own father had killed 2 brothers. Before taking the throne, his grandfather had eliminated 5. It was tradition, necessity, the price of imperial stability. But this was different. This was his son, except when he tried to feel paternal affection, he found only emptiness. The prince was a stranger, a variable in political equations, a potential problem wearing his bloodline. The advisors continued speaking their words, building architecture of justification. He does not need to be guilty, Your Majesty. He merely needs to be a vulnerability after your passing. If the generals believe he could be influenced, if rival factions think he could be controlled, his very existence becomes instability. Better to remove doubt before it can be exploited. The emperor listened. Somewhere in the palace, the prince studied his texts, unaware. Somewhere servants moved through their routines, ignorant of the machinery grinding to life. Somewhere the sun set on another day in an empire built on calculated murder, disguised as statecraft. The emperor made his decision not suddenly, not dramatically, but through the slow accumulation of poisoned logic, through fear dressed as prudence, through the terrible mathematics that valued stability over humanity. He would eliminate the uncertainty. He would remove his son, and he would do it in a manner that sent unmistakable message to any other potential claimants, any other sons who might harbor ambitions, any other factions who might see opportunity in royal blood. The method would be symbolic, unforgettable, a demonstration that even princes, even sons, even those who appeared harmless, were subject to imperial will. The emperor summoned his executioners and gave orders that would transform wine from celebration into execution, from symbol of life into instrument of death. The seeds of paranoia had found fertile soil. Now came the harvest. Chapter 5. The father's verdict. The council chamber had no official name. It did not appear on palace maps. Court historians did not record meetings held within its walls. Even its location was deliberately obscured, buried deep in the administrative wing behind doors marked as storage rooms and archives. But everyone who mattered knew it existed. This was where the empire's true business occurred, where decisions too sensitive for public record were made, where emperors and their most trusted advisors shaped reality. Before presenting it to the world, 7 men gathered there on a night when the moon hid behind clouds. The emperor sat at the table as head. His health had deteriorated visibly. In recent weeks, his skin held a grey pallor, his hands trembled slightly, though he tried to control them. But his eyes remained sharp, calculating, still capable of the cold assessment that had kept him alive and in power for 2 decades. To his right, the spymaster. His report lay on the table in front of him. To his left, the Grand Chancellor, the man responsible for transforming imperial will into administrative reality. Around the table, 3 senior generals representing different military factions, and the high priest whose endorsement would provide religious legitimacy. The emperor spoke first. "We are here to discuss succession stability. My health declines. This is not speculation, but fact. The empire will soon face transition. We must ensure that transition does not become crisis." Nods around the table. Everyone understood the actual agenda. This was not discussion, but performance, providing collective cover for a decision already made. The spymaster presented his findings again, more detailed this time. More emphasis on concerning patterns, less acknowledgement of innocent explanations. The prince has cultivated relationships beyond appropriate bounds for his station. He has demonstrated capabilities inconsistent with his professed disinterest in power. While I cannot prove active conspiracy, the potential for future instability is significant, one of the generals contributed. Should we not simply question him, directly determine his true intentions? The Grand Chancellor responded before the emperor could speak. And if he denies conspiracy, as he certainly would, what then? We cannot imprison an imperial son on suspicion alone. But neither can we allow uncertainty to persist once the emperor passes, and may heaven grant him many more years. But once the transition occurs, any doubt about succession will be exploited. The high priest leaned forward, his robes rustling in the chamber's silence. There is precedent, sacred precedent. The doctrine of necessary sacrifice holds that individual lives, even royal lives, may be forfeit when the stability of the realm demands it. Your father invoked this principle, your grandfather as well. The emperor listened to the justifications being constructed in real time. He could stop this. He could defend his son, demand actual evidence of actual crime, refuse to participate in murder disguised as statecraft. But stopping it would mean admitting doubt, admitting that perhaps his paranoia had led him to consider killing an innocent man, and emperors who admitted such doubts did not remain emperors for long. So he said nothing. The council interpreted his silence as permission. The conversation shifted from whether to how an execution would need to be managed carefully. One of the generals observed, "We cannot simply announce that the prince conspired and was punished. That invites too many questions, draws too much attention to succession issues." The Grand Chancellor nodded. "It must appear inevitable, tragic, but necessary, a consequence of some failing that everyone can understand and accept." They debated methods, public execution too dramatic turns the prince into a martyr, assassination too suspicious invites conspiracy theories that could destabilize for years. Imprisonment leaves the problem alive, allows factions to rally around him as alternative claimant. The spymaster offered a different approach. It should be symbolic, should send a message, but not one that can be openly discussed, should feel like punishment. But for crimes that remain officially unspoken. He paused, letting the idea settle. Wine. Everyone turned toward him. Wine, he repeated, drowning, but not in water, in wine. In luxury turned lethal, in the very symbol of celebration and excess. The message would be clear without being explicit. Indulgence, corruption, a prince who indulged too much, who lost himself in pleasure rather than duty. The high priest considered this. It could work religiously. We could frame it as divine judgment, without directly accusing, without public trial. One general remained skeptical. How do we explain it? How do we tell the court, the city, the provinces that an imperial prince drowned in wine? We do not explain. The spymaster, his voice held cold certainty. We announce tragedy. We express imperial grief. We make it clear through silence that questions are unwelcome And we move forward. Anyone who understands the true message understands. Anyone who does not is no threat. The Emperor spoke for the first time since the meeting began. When the spy master did not hesitate. Soon within the week, while your health still allows you to be visibly in control, while the decision appears strong rather than desperate. The Emperor nodded slowly, and the body buried quietly. The Grand Chancellor answered. No monument, no official mourning period beyond what protocol minimally requires. His name remains in family records, but without honor, without detail. Future generations will note his existence and his death and wonder, but never know this was the final cruelty. Not just death, but erasure, the transformation of a life into a footnote, a question mark, a cautionary tale told through deliberate absence of information. The meeting concluded. Each man left separately, minutes apart, using different exits, returning to their public roles as if nothing had occurred. The Emperor remained in the chamber alone. For a long moment he stared at the report in front of him, his son's life reduced to pages of suspicion and insinuation, his own paranoia reflected back as prudent leadership, his fear transformed into justified action. He tried to feel something, regret perhaps, or sorrow, or the weight of what he was about to do. But there was nothing, only emptiness, only the cold logic that had carried him to power and kept him there. Only the understanding that emperors do not have the luxury of paternal love. He stood, his body ached with more than just illness, with the accumulated burden of every terrible decision made in the name of necessity. Orders would be given in the morning. A prince would be summoned under the pretense of private audience. Guards would be positioned, executioners prepared, a chamber readied, wine would be poured not for celebration, but for something far darker. The machinery of state-sanctioned murder would turn oiled by centuries of precedent, justified by doctrines written by scholars who never had to watch their own children die. The Emperor walked slowly back to his private chambers. Behind him, the council chamber returned to shadow, and somewhere in the palace, the prince slept his last night of ignorance. Chapter 6. Drowned in wine. The summons arrived at dawn. A messenger in imperial livery delivered the sealed order with formal precision. The prince was commanded to attend his father in the private audience chamber immediately. No advisors, no servants, just father and son. The prince's hands shook as he read. Private audiences with the emperor were rare historically. They preceded one of two outcomes: elevation to significant responsibility or removal from potential power. Given the current atmosphere, the prince suspected the latter, but he had no choice. Refusing a direct imperial command was itself treason. He dressed carefully, formal robes, purple silk embroidered with symbols of his rank. He wanted to appear dignified, respectful, whatever was coming. He would face it, as a prince should. 2 guards waited outside his chambers. They escorted him through the palace's back corridors, not the grand processional routes, but service passages used by servants and minor officials. This detail was not lost on the prince. When emperors honored sons, they did so publicly. When they eliminated them, they did so in shadows. They arrived at a door the prince did not recognize. The guards opened it, gestured for him to enter. Inside the chamber was as described earlier, no windows, a single door now closing behind him. Bronze vessel filled with dark wine torches casting uncertain light. But his father was not there. Instead, 6 men in executioner's masks, 6 men who moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had done this before. The prince understood immediately. He tried to run back toward the door, but it was already bolted. The men advanced, not rushing, not speaking, just closing distance with terrible patience. He tried to speak, to reason, to demand explanation. Please, I have done nothing. I am loyal. I have no ambitions. I only wanted to survive. His words echoed of stone unanswered. They seized him, not brutally, but firmly, hands gripping his arms, his shoulders, his silk robes bunched beneath their grip, purple fabric creasing, wrinkled, losing its dignity. They dragged him toward the vessel. The wine's surface reflected torchlight, made the liquid seem to move, seem alive. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and floral, with undertones of something medicinal, something added to make the death slower or faster, or merely to mask other scents. The prince did not want to contemplate. He struggled not with any real hope of escape, but because struggling was the only response left, purely animal, purely instinctive, the body's refusal to cooperate in its own destruction. They positioned him at the vessel's edge. One executioner gripped his hair, forced his head down toward the liquid. The prince's final words are not noble or philosophical, not a declaration of innocence or curse upon his father. They were simply no, repeated over and over, no, 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 no. The begging of a terrified man who understood that reason and justice and filial bonds meant nothing against state machinery designed specifically to overcome such considerations. His face touched the wine cold. Despite the chamber's warmth, the smell filled his nose, his throat. He tried to hold his breath, but panic made that impossible. His body demanded air, demanded oxygen, demanded life. He inhaled wine. The burning started immediately, liquid in lungs, drowning from the inside, coughing, only poured more wine deeper, struggling, only exhausted oxygen faster. The executioners held firm. This was the longest part. The minutes stretched as the prince's body fought, convulsed, experienced every stage of drowning while submerged in luxury rather than water. The symbolism was not lost on those who had planned this: a prince killed by excess, by pleasure, by the very wealth and privilege that marked his status. It could be whispered about in metaphors: a prince who indulged too deeply, who lost himself in wine and decadence. The truth would remain locked in this chamber. Finally, the struggling slowed, weakened, stopped. The executioners released him. The prince's body slumped against the vessel. Wine dripped from his hair, his robes. His face turned away from the torchlight, his eyes open, but no longer seeing. One executioner checked for pulse, found none, nodded to his colleagues. They began the cleanup. This too had been planned. The body would be removed through underground passages, buried in an unmarked location far from royal crypts. The vessel would be emptied, cleaned, returned to storage. The chamber would be scrubbed until no trace remained. Within hours, it would be as if nothing had occurred. A messenger was dispatched to the emperor. 3 words: "It is done." The emperor received the message in his private study. He sat motionless for a long moment. Then he folded the paper precisely, placed it in the brazier, watched it burn. He did not weep, did not mourn, did not allow himself any outward sign of emotion. He had done what emperors do. He had sacrificed his son for the stability of his throne. Whether this decision was just or necessary, or merely the action of a paranoid old man terrified of his own mortality, these questions would haunt the remaining months of his life. But he would never speak them aloud, never admit doubt. By midday, official word began circulating through the palace. The prince had taken ill suddenly, tragically. He died before physicians could attend him. The explanation satisfied no one, but was challenged by none. Those who understood the true story recognized the emperor's message. Any son, any rival, any potential claimant could be removed. Any threat to imperial stability would be eliminated with absolute prejudice. Those who did not understand simply noted that another royal had died under mysterious circumstances in a palace famous for such occurrences, and moved on with their lives. In the empire's grand ledger of deaths, one more name was added: print cause of death officially recorded as sudden illness. The truth preserved only in the memories of 7 men who met in a chamber that did not officially exist, and in the lingering scent of wine in a sealed room that would never again be used for any purpose, because even stone remembers some crimes. Chapter 7. An empire shaken. The official announcement was brief. The court received news of the prince's death with appropriate expressions of sorrow. Banners were lowered to half-staff for the minimum required period. Prayers were offered in the imperial temple. Officials wore mourning ribbons for exactly as long as protocol demanded, but beneath the formal observances something shifted. Whispers began immediately, not open accusations. No one was foolish enough to question the official narrative directly, but in private chambers over wine that now carried darker associations. In conversations held in gardens where walls could not listen, the truth spread. The emperor killed his own son. The why mattered less than the what. A father had murdered his child for reasons of state, for paranoia, for the same logic that had governed the dynasty for generations. But this time it felt different, perhaps because the prince had been so clearly harmless, or perhaps because the emperor's health was visibly failing, and the killing seemed less like strength and more like the desperate thrashing of a dying man trying to control what little remained of his power. The military commanders retreated to their garrisons. They attended required ceremonies. As their enthusiasm cooled, their reports came slower. Their requests for clarification on orders became more frequent. They were not quite insubordinate, but neither were they reliably obedient. If the emperor would kill a scholarly prince who posed no real threat, what might he do to generals with actual power better, to maintain distance better, to ensure their own forces were loyal to them personally rather than to an emperor who saw threats everywhere? The religious authorities divided. The high priest, who had participated in the secret council, maintained public support for the emperor, but younger clerics began questioning whether divine mandate could justify any action of father killing his son for political convenience. Where was the line? Where did necessary sacrifice become mere murder? They did not preach rebellion, but their sermons began emphasizing different scriptures passages about justice, about mercy, about the responsibilities of power. The merchant class read this situation with their characteristic pragmatism. They began moving assets, diversifying holdings across provinces, establishing relationships with multiple potential successors, rather than backing a single claimant. They had seen empires collapse before. Usually, it started like this, with an emperor who mistook cruelty for strength, with institutions that prioritized survival over principle, with a population that obeyed out of fear rather than respect. Fear worked until it didn't, and when it stopped working, the collapse came. Quickly, the remaining princes, the ones who survived their brother, watched and learned. They understood the message, but the message was not quite what the emperor intended. Yes, they learned that their father would kill them if he felt threatened, but they also learned that their father was terrified, that his power was more fragile than it appeared, that he was killing out of weakness, not strength, and weak emperors did not last. The provinces responded with calculated ambiguity. Governors sent letters of loyalty, but they also began retaining more tax revenue for local purposes, citing various administrative needs. They attended fewer imperial summonses, citing travel difficulties or local crises requiring attention. They were not quite rebelling, but neither were they quite obeying. The empire's edges began to fray, not dramatically, not with declarations of independence or military confrontations, but with the slow withdrawal of enthusiastic cooperation, with the gradual recognition that the center might not hold much longer. Foreign courts received the news with interest. Ambassadors sent detailed reports analyzing what the prince's death meant for imperial stability. Trade negotiations were quietly postponed, pending clearer understanding of succession. Troop movements along borders increased slightly. Nothing aggressive, just preparation, just positioning for whatever might come next. Within 4 months of the prince's death, the emperor's authority had eroded significantly. He still held his throne, still issued orders, still received the formal deference owed to imperial office. But the machinery of power no longer responded with the same efficiency. His commands were acknowledged, but implementation was slow. His presence no longer commanded fear so much as uncomfortable obligation. The empire was not yet in crisis, but it was certainly in decline, and everyone knew who to blame. The emperor had killed his son to ensure stability. Instead, he had triggered exactly the instability he feared, not through his son's actions, but through his own. The irony was lost on no one in the palace. Servants whispered in military camps. Soldiers told stories in temples. Priests offered prayers not for the emperor's health, but for the empire's survival. Once he died, and in an unmarked grave far from the capital, the prince's body rested, unknown, unrecognized, but not quite forgotten. Because his death had accomplished what his life never could. It had revealed the empire's fundamental weakness. It had exposed the paranoia eating away at power's foundations. The prince had become powerful in death, more powerful than he ever could have been in life, not through conspiracy or ambition, but through the simple fact of being murdered by a father too frightened to trust even his own blood. The empire would survive this for a time, but something essential had broken, something that no amount of force or tradition or official narrative could repair. Trust, not just in this emperor, but in the entire system, a dynasty built on calculated fratricide, on necessary sacrifice, on the murder of sons who threatened stability. People had tolerated this logic for generations because it worked, because stability was valuable, because the alternative seemed worse. But now they had seen the cost, made visible, made personal, made undeniable. And once you truly see the machinery of power, once you understand what it actually does to actual people, it becomes much harder to pretend it is necessary or justified, or anything other than what it is. A system that devours its own children and calls it statecraft. The empire shook not with earthquake violence, but with the tremor of foundations beginning to crack. And in the sealed chamber, where the prince had died, the wine vessel remained empty, cleaned, waiting. No one would use it again. But neither would anyone remove it. Some objects become monuments even when no one admits what they memorialize. Chapter 8. The Crown's Curse. The emperor died 6 months after drowning his son. His final weeks were agony. Not just physical, though the illness consumed him with fire and pain, but psychological, the kind of suffering that comes from understanding what you have done, what it has cost, what remains after you. He saw his son in dreams, not as he was in life, but as he died, face submerged in wine, eyes wide with betrayal, mouth open in silent accusation. The emperor would wake gasping, sometimes screaming, always alone, because he had long since driven away anyone who might offer comfort. The physicians called it fever delirium. But the emperor knew better. His succession was chaos. The remaining sons tore each other apart in civil war that lasted 7 years. The empire fractured into competing territories, each prince claiming legitimacy, each backed by different military factions. Millions died in the fighting. The dynasty that had lasted 3 centuries collapsed in less than a decade. Historians would later analyze the causes: economic factors, military overextension, provincial unrest, external pressure, all valid, all contributing factors. But those who lived through it understood the deeper truth. The empire died when the emperor drowned his son in wine, not because the prince was important, but because the act revealed that the entire system was built on sand, held together not by strength or wisdom or divine mandate, but by fear. And once fear is exposed as the only foundation, once people see that the emperor is not strong but terrified, once the machinery of justified murder becomes visible rather than hidden, authority evaporates. The wine chamber remained sealed for decades. New rulers came and went. The palace changed hands multiple times, but that particular room stayed locked. Servants claimed it was haunted. They reported hearing sounds in the night, splashing, gasping, coughing, begging, probably imagination, probably guilt, collective and individual, manifesting as ghost stories. Or perhaps stone really does remember. Eventually, the palace itself was abandoned to many memories. Too much blood, so much history weighing down marble and gold, until the whole structure felt like tomb rather than seat of power. Nature reclaimed it. Vines grew through windows, birds nested in throne rooms. Wind and rain slowly erased the inscriptions proclaiming eternal dynasty and divine authority. Archaeologists would later excavate the site. They found the chamber, found the bronze vessel, found records in sealed archives that pieced together what happened. The prince's name was recovered, recorded, published in academic journals. He got a footnote in history. After all, but the real lesson, the one that echoes through centuries, is not about him specifically. It is about the nature of power, what it does to those who wield it, what it demands, what it transforms them into. The emperor thought he was protecting his throne. Instead, he destroyed it. He thought he was eliminating a threat. Instead, he became one. He thought he could control his legacy. Instead, he ensured he would be remembered only for his greatest crime. This is the crown's curse, not supernatural, not mystical, but brutally practical. Power that requires the murder of innocents to maintain itself is already dead. It just has not realized it yet. Every throne built on the bones of sacrificed children will eventually collapse, not because of divine justice or cosmic balance, but because systems built on fear and violence contain the seeds of their own destruction. You can murder your way to the top, you can murder to stay there. But eventually, you run out of victims, or others decide to murder you first, or the sheer weight of accumulated cruelty becomes too much for any institutional structure to bear. The emperor drowned his son in wine, and in doing so drowned his own dynasty in blood. His name, like his victim, is remembered now only in academic texts, studied as cautionary example, referenced in discussions of political philosophy and the limits of absolute power, both men reduced to symbols. But sometimes symbols are enough. Sometimes the story itself is the monument. A prince who did nothing wrong except be born into the wrong family at the wrong time. A father who sacrificed his own child on the altar of his own paranoia. An empire that confused cruelty with strength until it forgot the difference, and a bronze vessel filled with wine that became an execution device, that became a haunted relic, that became an archaeological curiosity, that became a story. This story, the one that refuses to fade, even after centuries, even after the palace crumbled and the dynasty vanished, and everyone involved turned to dust. Because some truths are too important to be erased, some warnings too vital to be forgotten. The crown's curse is not that power corrupts, it is that power reveals, shows you exactly what you are willing to do. When afraid, when threatened, when convinced that your survival matters more than anyone else's life. And once revealed, that truth cannot be hidden again. No matter how many records you destroy, or names you erase, or narratives you construct. The emperor tried to erase his son. Instead, he made him immortal, not as a hero or a martyr, but as a question: how many more princes must drown in wine? How many more sons must be sacrificed? How many more times must we repeat this cycle before we finally admit that the crown's weight is not worth the blood required to keep it polished? The answer, of course, is that we will repeat it forever, probably because power is addictive and humans are creatures of habit, and history is a spiral, not a line. But at least now, you know, at least now, you understand what lies beneath the gold and ceremony, the official pronouncements. At least now, when you see power, you will remember the wine chamber, and perhaps that is enough not to prevent the next tragedy, but to recognize it when it comes, which it always does.